What if the most dangerous man in Russia wasn't a general, a spy, or a revolutionary, but a wandering peasant who couldn't read a battle map? In the winter of 1916, 4 separate groups of powerful men were secretly planning to kill the same person. A prince, a politician, a doctor, even members of the royal family itself. They did not agree on politics. They did not agree on the future of Russia. But on one thing, they were united. Grigori Rasputin had to die. The strange part isn't that he was murdered. It's how many people wanted the chance to do it first. To understand why an empire turned against one man, you have to go back to where he came from, a place so remote that St. Petersburg might as well have been the moon. Rasputin was born in a small Siberian village called Pokrovskoye along the Tura River, sometime around 1869. There were no palaces here, no marble staircases, only frozen fields and wooden huts. He was a peasant's son, uneducated, restless, and by his own admission, no stranger to trouble. Neighbors would later recall a wild young man who drank too much and disappeared for long stretches into the countryside. Something changed after one of those disappearances. Rasputin claimed he experienced a religious vision, and he began wandering from monastery to monastery, calling himself a stronic, a holy wanderer. He was never formally ordained. He had no theological training, yet he developed a magnetic, unsettling presence, the kind that made strangers lean in closer when he spoke. His eyes, witnesses said, seemed to look straight through people. Whether that was spiritual power or simple charisma didn't matter. In the drawing rooms of the Russian aristocracy, something about this dirty, unwashed peasant felt irresistible, dangerously irresistible. By 1903, Rasputin had reached St. Petersburg, the glittering capital of the Russian Empire, a city of canals, opera houses, and imperial ambition. High society was, at that moment, hungry for mysticism. The aristocracy dabbled in seances and faith healers, bored with formal religion and searching for something that felt authentic. Into this world walked a barefoot peasant preacher who spoke in blunt, earthy parables. He shocked people. He also fascinated them. Bishops and countesses alike began inviting him into their homes, unaware that this obscure Siberian wanderer was about to collide with the single most protected family in the empire. That collision happened in 1905, when Rasputin was introduced to Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra. On the surface, it was an unremarkable meeting, one holy man among many who passed through the palace. But the royal family carried a secret so devastating that it was hidden even from most of the government. Their only son, the heir to the Russian throne, was dying by inches, and no doctor in the empire could save him. Rasputin didn't know it yet, but he had just walked into the one room in Russia where he could make himself irreplaceable. The heir's name was Alexei, born in 1904 after 4 daughters, the long-awaited son who would carry the Romanov dynasty forward. He was also born with hemophilia, a blood disorder inherited through the empress's own bloodline, traced back to Queen Victoria of Britain. In an age before modern treatment, even a minor bruise could trigger internal bleeding that swelled joints, caused agonizing pain, and threatened the boy's life. The parents lived in constant, silent terror. And because revealing the illness could destabilize the monarchy, they told almost no one. Alexandra carried this fear alone, behind a mask of composure. Then, during one of Alexei's medical crises, Rasputin was summoned. What happened next remains debated by historians, but the effect on the boy's condition, and on the empress, was undeniable. Alexei's bleeding slowed. His pain eased. Whether through calming suggestion, reduced stress, or simple coincidence, Alexandra became convinced that Rasputin possessed a healing gift no doctor could match. From that moment forward, she saw him not as a peasant mystic, but as the one person standing between her son and death. That conviction would prove impossible to shake and impossible for outsiders to understand. For Alexandra, Rasputin's power over Alexei's illness became proof of divine favor, a sign that God himself had sent this man to protect the dynasty. She wrote to him with desperate devotion, trusted his judgment on matters far beyond medicine, and defended him against every accusation that reached the palace. But almost no one outside the family's inner circle knew about Alexei's condition. To the rest of Russian society, all they saw was a foreign-born empress who had elevated an uneducated Siberian peasant to a position of extraordinary influence, and no explanation was ever offered as to why.
That silence would prove catastrophic. Without the truth about the heir's illness, the public filled in the blanks with rumor, and rumor is rarely kind. Whispers spread through St. Petersburg salons that Rasputin held hypnotic power over the empress, that his influence stretched into government appointments, that a filthy peasant was quietly running the affairs of the Russian Empire from behind a curtain. Newspapers hinted at scandal without naming it directly. The less people knew, the more they imagined, and what they imagined was far more dangerous to Rasputin than the truth could have ever been. Rasputin did little to calm the storm. He drank heavily in public taverns, boasted of his closeness to the royal family, and surrounded himself with female admirers eager for his blessing or his attention. Stories of drunken nights and scandalous behavior traveled quickly through a city that thrived on gossip. Some accounts were exaggerated by enemies looking to destroy him. Others were entirely true. Either way, the gap between the modest, God-fearing image the empress believed in and the man drinking wine in restaurant back rooms grew wider every year, and it was becoming impossible to hide. As Rasputin's access to the palace deepened, so did his influence over decisions that had nothing to do with healing. Alexandra began asking his opinion on church appointments, ministerial candidates, even matters of state policy. He had no formal position, no title, no vote, and yet his word could make or break a bishop's career. Ambitious men figured this out quickly. If you wanted advancement in the Russian Empire, it sometimes helped more to please Rasputin than to please the Tsar himself. A parallel system of power was forming, invisible on any official chart, but very real behind closed doors. This informal power terrified Russia's political establishment. Ministers who had spent decades climbing through loyal service now found themselves outmaneuvered by a peasant with no education and no accountability. Some tried to warn the Tsar directly. Nicholas, exhausted by the pressures of ruling a vast and troubled empire, often deflected the criticism, unwilling to confront his wife over the one thing that seemed to bring her peace. Each dismissed warning only deepened the resentment building among Russia's elite. They weren't just losing arguments. Many believed they were watching their nation's government slip out of qualified hands entirely. The church hierarchy had its own reasons for alarm. Rasputin belonged to no recognized religious order, yet he moved through orthodox circles claiming spiritual authority, blessing people, interpreting scripture, and positioning himself as a holy figure. Senior clergy who had spent their lives earning theological credentials watched an unlicensed mystic gain more influence over the royal family than any bishop in the empire. Some churchmen, who initially welcomed him as a fellow ascetic, later turned into his fiercest accusers, horrified by stories of his private conduct. To them, Rasputin wasn't just politically dangerous. He was a spiritual fraud wearing the mask of holiness. By the early 1910s, Rasputin's reputation had become a national conversation. Newspapers, despite censorship, published thinly veiled criticism using code names and insinuation. Cartoonists drew him as a puppet master pulling the strings of the crown. Politicians in the Duma, Russia's fledgling parliament, began openly questioning his role in government affairs. For a monarchy already struggling to look modern and competent in the eyes of its people, Rasputin had become a gift to every critic who wanted to portray the Romanovs as backward, superstitious, and dangerously out of touch with the 20th century unfolding around them. Then, in 1911, a warning came from an unexpected source: Russia's own Prime Minister, Pyotr Stolypin, one of the most powerful men in the empire. Stolypin ordered an investigation into Rasputin's private life and personally urged the Tsar to remove him from the palace. Nicholas listened politely and did almost nothing. Alexandra was furious that anyone would dare interfere. Stolypin was assassinated later that year by a revolutionary gunman, unrelated to Rasputin, but symbolic nonetheless. One of the few men with the authority to challenge Rasputin's influence was gone, and the warnings that followed grew quieter, not louder. Rasputin's enemies didn't just include statesmen and bishops. Ordinary Russians, struggling under poverty and rising food prices, heard stories of a peasant living in luxury apartments, dining with countesses, and supposedly controlling ministers from behind palace walls. To them, he represented everything corrupt about a distant, disconnected monarchy, proof that access to power depended not on merit, but on flattery and mysticism. Revolutionary pamphlets seized on his image, using Rasputin as a symbol of imperial rot. He became, almost accidentally, one of the most effective pieces of anti-monarchist propaganda the revolutionaries never had to invent themselves.
Rumors escalated into full scandal in 1910 when journalist Sergei Trufanov, a former monk turned Rasputin critic, began publishing sensational accusations about orgies, manipulation, and moral corruption inside the palace's inner circle. Much of it was unverifiable, some of it exaggerated for effect, but the damage was already done. Censors tried to suppress the stories, which only made the public more certain something was being hidden. In an empire without a free press to set the record straight, silence itself became evidence of guilt. Every denial from the palace seemed to confirm exactly what people already suspected.
Then came a devastating photograph, or rather, the rumor of one. Circulating gossip claimed compromising images existed showing Rasputin surrounded by admiring women in intimate settings. Whether entirely true or partly invented, the images fueled a national obsession. Foreign newspapers picked up the story, embarrassing the Romanovs on the world stage at a moment when European monarchies were already being scrutinized for excess and decline. For Alexandra, every attack on Rasputin felt like an attack on her son's survival. For everyone else, it felt like proof that the empire's future rested in the hands of a man who could not be trusted. By 1914, Europe stood on the edge of catastrophe. As the great powers mobilized for what would become the First World War, Rasputin reportedly warned the Tsar against entering the conflict, predicting disaster for Russia and the monarchy itself. Nicholas ignored him. Russia joined the war. Within months, the warning began to look prophetic. Russian forces suffered devastating losses, supply lines collapsed, and the economy buckled under the strain. Rasputin's prediction, whether genuine foresight or lucky guesswork, only deepened Alexandra's belief that he possessed something no ordinary man could see. It deepened everyone else's suspicion of him, too. In 1915, Nicholas made a fateful decision. Determined to rally the struggling war effort, he left the capital to personally command Russian forces at the front. It seemed like an act of leadership. In practice, it left Empress Alexandra in charge of the government back home, a German-born empress ruling a country now at war with Germany, guided in private by a peasant mystic accused of scandal and manipulation. It was, politically, one of the most dangerous combinations imaginable, and it placed Rasputin closer than ever to the actual machinery of the Russian state at the worst possible moment in its history. With Nicholas away at the front, Alexandra leaned on Rasputin more heavily than ever, consulting him on ministerial appointments and government decisions that shaped the nation's direction during wartime. Ministers who displeased him were dismissed. Loyalists who flattered him rose in influence. Russia's government began to resemble a revolving door,
with capable men pushed aside in favor of candidates chosen, critics claimed, for their willingness to please a single unelected advisor. The stability the empire desperately needed during a brutal war was instead replaced by chaos, confusion, and a leadership crisis unfolding in full view of a starving, restless public. The war made everything worse. Soldiers died by the hundreds of thousands. Bread lines stretched through Russian cities as inflation soared and supplies dwindled. Meanwhile, rumors swirled that Rasputin, and by extension the Empress herself, held secret sympathies for Germany, Alexandra's ancestral homeland. There was no credible evidence for this, but evidence rarely mattered anymore. In a nation exhausted by suffering, people needed someone to blame, and Rasputin's foreign-sounding sponsor and mysterious influence made him the perfect villain. Newspapers openly speculated about treason inside the palace walls. The word traitor began attaching itself to his name. Even loyal monarchists, men who believed deeply in the Tsar's divine right to rule, began to see Rasputin as an existential threat to the monarchy itself. If the dynasty fell, they reasoned, it wouldn't be because of revolutionaries in the streets. It would be because the royal family had allowed itself to be captured by scandal, superstition, and one uncontrollable outsider. For these men, killing Rasputin wasn't treason against the crown. It was an act meant to save it. That distinction, saving the monarchy by murdering the man closest to the Empress, would soon draw some of Russia's most powerful aristocrats into a single, desperate plot. Among them was Prince Felix Yusupov, heir to one of the wealthiest fortunes in the empire, married to the Tsar's own niece. Yusupov was theatrical, restless, and deeply unsettled by what he saw as Rasputin's corrupting grip on the royal family. He began cultivating a friendship with Rasputin, gaining his trust slowly, visiting him under the guise of seeking spiritual guidance for a supposed illness. It was a calculated performance. Behind the warm conversations and shared meals, Yusupov was quietly assembling a circle of like-minded men who shared his growing conviction that Russia's salvation required Rasputin's death, and soon. Yusupov wasn't alone. He recruited Vladimir Purishkevich, a fiery, ultra-nationalist member of the Duma who had denounced Rasputin's influence in a thunderous public speech, warning that the monarchy itself was being dragged toward ruin. He also drew in Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, a cousin of the Tsar himself, whose royal blood gave the conspiracy a dangerous legitimacy. A military doctor, Stanislas de Lazavert, was pulled in to help. What began as private grumbling among aristocrats was becoming something far more serious, an organized plan formed inside the empire's most privileged circles to remove Rasputin permanently from the palace's orbit. Through the autumn of 1916, the conspirators met repeatedly in Yusupov's grand St. Petersburg palace, debating method and opportunity. They needed somewhere private, somewhere Rasputin would come willingly and without suspicion. Yusupov offered his own home, inviting Rasputin under the pretense of introducing him to his wife, Princess Irina, a woman Rasputin had in fact never actually met, though he didn't know that detail would later expose the lie. The date was set for the night of December 16, 1916. Whatever doubts lingered among the conspirators, there was no turning back now. The plan had a place, a time, and a target. That night, Rasputin arrived at the Yusupov Palace, expecting a quiet social visit. He was led downstairs into a private room, prepared with wine and pastries, laced, according to the conspirators' later accounts, with poison. What happened over the following hours remains one of the most debated episodes in Russian history, pieced together from conflicting testimonies given by men with every reason to shape the story afterward. What is certain is this: the conspirators believed they were ending a threat to the empire. What they didn't anticipate was how difficult, both physically and symbolically, that ending would prove to be. According to Yusupov's own retelling,
The poison seemed to have little visible effect, and after a tense, drawn-out confrontation, Rasputin was shot. He collapsed, and then, by several accounts, rose again. Panic spread through the group as their carefully staged plan unraveled into chaos. More shots reportedly followed before the ordeal finally ended. Historians have long questioned how much of this dramatic account was true and how much was embellished afterward to make the killing sound almost supernatural. Fitting, perhaps, for a man whose entire legend had always blurred the line between reality and myth.
In the chaos that followed, the conspirators wrapped the body and transported it through the freezing December night to the Neva River, breaking through the ice to dispose of it in the frigid water below. They believed they had erased the problem entirely, that Rasputin would simply vanish, and with him, the scandal he represented. They were wrong. Within days, the body was discovered beneath the ice, and news of his death spread through St. Petersburg like wildfire. Rather than quietly disappearing, Rasputin's murder became the most talked-about event in the capital, discussed in every home, tavern, and palace hallway.
For Empress Alexandra, the news was devastating. She had lost the man she believed was protecting her son's life, and she suspected immediately who was responsible. For Nicholas, rushing back from the front, the murder placed him in an impossible position. Members of his own family and closest aristocratic circles had conspired to kill a man under his roof's protection. Punishing them fully risked alienating the nobility he depended on. Punishing them lightly risked looking weak. In the end, the conspirators faced only mild consequences: exile from the capital, quietly removed rather than formally prosecuted for murder.
The public reaction split sharply along familiar lines. Many aristocrats and conservatives quietly celebrated Rasputin's death as an act of patriotic necessity, believing it might finally restore order and reputation to a struggling monarchy. Revolutionaries and reformers saw it differently. Proof, they argued, that the entire system was so broken it required murder in dark palace basements just to function. Rather than saving the Romanov dynasty, Rasputin's assassination exposed just how fractured Russian society had become, with even the empire's most privileged families resorting to conspiracy and killing rather than trusting reform through legitimate political channels.
Rasputin's death did nothing to slow the crisis engulfing Russia. Bread shortages worsened, war casualties mounted. Public trust in the monarchy, already fragile, continued collapsing. Less than 3 months after his body was pulled from the Neva, revolution erupted in the streets of Petrograd, the city's wartime name. Crowds demanding bread and an end to autocracy overwhelmed the government within days. By March 1917, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne his family had held for 3 centuries. The man so many believed was destroying the monarchy from within was gone. The monarchy itself did not survive much longer without him. This timing raises one of history's most haunting questions. Did Rasputin's presence accelerate the monarchy's collapse, or did his death simply remove the last illusion protecting it? Some historians argue his scandalous reputation had already inflicted irreversible damage to the crown's legitimacy long before the assassins ever entered Yusupov's palace. Others suggest his absence removed a convenient scapegoat, forcing the public to confront the deeper failures of autocratic rule itself, the war, the poverty, the corruption that had nothing to do with one Siberian mystic at all. Perhaps both explanations are true, tangled together in ways no single answer can fully untangle. What makes Rasputin's story so enduring isn't simply the murder itself, but the sheer number of people who wanted him dead, and for entirely different reasons. The Empress's inner circle feared losing him. Everyone outside that circle feared what he represented. Politicians saw a threat to competent governance. Clergy saw a threat to religious authority. Nobles saw a threat to the dynasty's survival. Revolutionaries saw a symbol of everything corrupt about the old order.
Rarely in history has one man simultaneously embodied so many different fears for so many different groups, all converging on the same conclusion. He had to go.
And yet, stripped of legend and rumor, the historical Rasputin remains difficult to fully define. Was he a cynical manipulator who exploited a desperate mother's grief for personal gain? Or a genuinely devoted, if deeply flawed, believer who truly thought he was saving a dying child? Surviving letters suggest sincerity in his devotion to Alexei, even as his personal conduct scandalized the very society he moved through. He may have been both things at once, capable of real compassion in the palace's private rooms and reckless indulgence in the taverns of St. Petersburg. History rarely offers simple villains, however tempting simplicity can be.
What's certain is that Rasputin understood, better than almost anyone in his position, how quickly perception could shape reality. He never held elected office. He never commanded an army. He built influence entirely through personal relationships, trust, and the desperate hope of a mother who believed he alone could save her son. In a rigid, hierarchical empire built on titles and bloodlines, an illiterate Siberian peasant reached the innermost chamber of imperial power through nothing but conviction and presence. That achievement, remarkable on its own terms, terrified an establishment built entirely on inherited privilege, and it never forgave him for it.
The murder itself has taken on a mythology almost as powerful as Rasputin's life. Stories of poison that failed to work, of a man rising after being shot, of near supernatural resilience have been retold and exaggerated for over a century, transforming a desperate, panicked killing into something closer to legend. Forensic reviews conducted decades later have cast doubt on several details from Yusupov's own account, suggesting some elements were dramatized to justify the killing after the fact. The real events in that basement were almost certainly more chaotic, more frightened, and far less theatrical than the story that has survived him.
For decades afterward, Rasputin's name became shorthand in Western culture for corrupt influence, hypnotic manipulation, and the danger of unchecked access to power. Films, songs, and novels transformed him into a near mythical figure, often stripped entirely of the desperate human context that first brought him into the palace: a dying child, a terrified mother, and a system with no honest place to turn. The caricature of Rasputin as a sinister, all-powerful sorcerer obscures a more uncomfortable truth: that ordinary human fear and desperation, not dark magic, gave an uneducated peasant more influence over an empire than any general or minister.
The Romanov family itself did not long outlive him. In July 1918, roughly a year and a half after Rasputin's death, Nicholas, Alexandra, and their 5 children were executed by Bolshevik revolutionaries in a basement in Yekaterinburg, ending the 300-year Romanov dynasty in a single brutal night. Alexei, the boy Rasputin had once claimed to heal, died alongside his parents and sisters, never reaching adulthood, never inheriting the throne he was born for. The empire Rasputin had been accused of destroying collapsed entirely within 2 years of his murder, swallowed by forces far larger than any single mystic could have controlled.
It is tempting, looking back, to imagine Rasputin as the single thread that unraveled an empire. Remove him, and everything might have been saved. But the deeper truth is less satisfying and more unsettling. Russia in 1916 was a nation strained by war, poverty, inequality, and a political system unwilling to adapt to a changing world. Rasputin didn't create those pressures. He became their most visible symbol, a lightning rod absorbing blame that might otherwise have been distributed across generations of accumulated grievance. Killing him didn't remove the storm. It only removed the figure everyone had agreed to blame for the weather.
This is perhaps the most human element of the entire story. When systems fail, people often search for a single face to hold responsible, someone whose removal promises to fix everything at once.
Rasputin offered exactly that kind of target. Mysterious enough to seem dangerous, close enough to power to seem responsible, foreign enough in manner and background to seem like an outsider corrupting something pure. His death satisfied a desperate psychological need across Russian society, even though the actual crisis facing the empire had almost nothing to do with him personally. Scapegoats rarely solve the problems they're blamed for.
Historians today largely agree that Rasputin's influence, while real, has been dramatically overstated by both his enemies and his later mythologizers. He did not single-handedly control Russian foreign policy. He did not orchestrate the empire's military failures. What he did do was expose, through his very presence, how isolated and vulnerable the royal family had become, cut off from honest counsel, dependent on secrecy, and unwilling to confront uncomfortable truths, even as their empire crumbled around them. In that sense, Rasputin wasn't the disease that killed the monarchy. He was one of its most visible, undeniable symptoms.
Even the men who murdered him seemed to sense, almost immediately, that they had misjudged what his death would accomplish. Yusupov spent much of the rest of his long life, he lived until 1967, retelling and reshaping the story of that December night, seemingly searching for meaning in an act that ultimately failed to save the empire he claimed to be protecting. Purushkevich died just 2 years later, during the Russian Civil War, watching the very revolution he had hoped Rasputin's death might prevent instead arrive in full, unstoppable force. Neither man got the outcome he had risked everything for. What remains today is not really the story of a magician or a sorcerer, despite how popular culture has often chosen to remember him. It is the story of a broken system, searching desperately for someone to blame, and finding, in one uneducated peasant from Siberia, the perfect vessel for every fear an empire could no longer contain. Rasputin didn't destroy Russia's monarchy through mystical power. He revealed, simply by existing at its center, just how fragile that monarchy had already become, propped up by secrecy, superstition, and a desperate mother's unanswered prayers for her dying son.
Perhaps that is the real reason so many people wanted Rasputin dead, not because killing him would fix anything, but because his presence forced everyone around him to confront uncomfortable truths they preferred to ignore. The aristocracy had to confront its own irrelevance. The clergy had to confront its declining authority. The government had to confront its failure to manage a nation at war. And the Empress herself had to confront the unbearable knowledge that her son's survival depended on a man society despised. Removing Rasputin felt to many like removing the mirror, reflecting all of it back at them. More than a century later, Rasputin's grave, if it can even be called that, no longer exists. His body, initially buried near the imperial family's residence, was exhumed and burned by revolutionary soldiers shortly after the monarchy fell, erasing the last physical trace of the man who had once seemed untouchable. No monument marks where he died. No official record fully agrees on how. What remains instead is a story, retold and reshaped by nearly every generation since, each finding in Rasputin whatever explanation feels most satisfying for the collapse of an empire that many believed would last forever. And that, in the end, may be Rasputin's strangest legacy of all. A single peasant, born without status, education, or wealth, became so entangled in the fate of one of history's great empires that a century of historians, filmmakers, and storytellers still cannot fully agree on who he really was: villain or victim, manipulator or true believer, symptom or cause. The question itself has outlived every person who once demanded his death, proving that some historical figures matter less for the answers they provide than for the uncomfortable questions they force everyone else to keep asking, long after they're gone. Rasputin's story endures because it touches something deeply human,
the fear of losing control, the desperation of a parent trying to save a child, the danger of secrecy in the halls of power, and the terrifying speed with which trust can curdle into conspiracy. Every era finds its own version of this story. An outsider granted unexplained access, a system too proud or too frightened to explain itself honestly to the people it governs, and the quiet, mounting resentment that follows. Empires rarely fall because of one man, but they often fall, in part, because of what that one man is allowed to represent.
So why did everyone want Rasputin dead? Not because of sorcery, and not entirely because of scandal. They wanted him dead because he had become the visible symbol of everything they were too afraid to say directly. That the monarchy was failing, that the war was unwinnable, that the old certainties of empire were dissolving in real time, and no one in power seemed capable of stopping it. Killing the symbol felt to desperate men in a desperate age like it might somehow kill the crisis itself. It never does. It never has. And in December 1916, it certainly didn't.
In the end, Rasputin's death changed almost nothing, and yet it changed everything about how the world would remember Russia's final imperial years. He became the face of a collapse far larger than himself, a peasant mystic forever bound to the fall of an empire he neither built nor could have saved. Perhaps that is the final haunting truth of his story. History rarely lets us blame just one man for the fall of an entire world, but it almost always tries to. And in Rasputin, it found the perfect man to try it on.
If you are a hunter, subscribe and join the hunt. Before you go, thank you for staying until the very end. In a world of endless scrolling and short attention spans, you chose to spend this time exploring real human stories. That means more than you know. If these stories moved you, made you think, or helped you see the world a little differently, please subscribe and turn on notifications. It's the best way to support this channel and make sure more stories like these continue to be told. And if one of these stories stayed with you after the video ended, share it with someone you care about. One message, one repost can help these voices reach someone who needs to hear them. Leave a comment and tell me which story touched you the most. I read every one. Thank you for your time, your curiosity, and your heart. I'll see you in the next story. If you are a hunter, subscribe and join the hunt.